Gary stepped hesitantly into the reception area and immediately encountered the secretary's displeased look. "Mr. Artell is busy." Gary timidly sat down on a chair close to the door. "It's all right, I'll wait. I urgently need to sign a vacation application." Megan grimaced, as if she had bitten into a whole lemon, peel and all. "Gary, you're wasting your time. Mr. Artell won't sign your application. What kind of vacation can there be in the middle of repair season?" Even the old-timers of the organisation were more afraid of this woman than Mr. Artell himself. Each morning she issued commands to foremen, supervised material loading and unloading, and even summoned truants and other rule-breakers to the reception room to write explanatory notes. Gary didn't escalate the situation, but decided to wait quietly. For about an hour she busied herself with various tasks, occasionally casting hostile glances at the disturber of her peace. Finally, she angrily threw the hefty folders onto her desk and marched into the chief's office. "Mr. Artell, Gary is waiting here. I told him you didn't ask for him." Mr. Artell's booming voice carried across the office. "How long has he been waiting? Let him come in. And Megan, how many times have I asked you to approach visitors respectfully? What if someone has an urgent matter?" The secretary rushed out of the chief's office, her face flushed, and Gary felt triumphant. He entered the chief's office, carefully closing the door behind him. "Gary, tell me what you need, but make it quick." The chief shuffled a pile of papers. The man silently handed over a folded sheet of paper. "It's a vacation request, Mr. Artell. I really need it. Family reasons. Just 10 days, please." Mr. Artell snorted disapprovingly. "Why do you request leave at such a crucial time? You know we have deadlines." Gary stepped up to the chief's desk. "Mr. Artell, my mother is ill. A neighbour called, says she's in bad shape. She lives in the village and can't manage alone anymore." Mr. Artell came around the table, sympathy evident in his eyes. "Now, that's what you should have led with." He walked to the middle of the floor and turned around. "Yes, our parents age so quickly while we stay busy. We never find time for them. Gary, how did you let your mother end up so helpless?" Gary was caught off guard. "Mr. Artell, well, I—" "Enough. Save your explanations for your mother." Mr. Artell signed the paper. "Take this to accounting yourself, and inform the site manager who'll cover for you. You've arranged that, I hope?" "Yes, Mr. Artell." Craig agreed to step in. "He's young but capable." The chief nodded, and Gary exhaled with relief and hurried home. Now came the hardest part, explaining to his wife. Shortly after New Year's, she'd announced they would spend the summer at a resort, like proper people. Gary hadn't objected then, but 6 months ago he couldn't have predicted today's events. Though he dreaded what awaited him at home, it was too late to turn back. He resolutely opened his apartment door. Heather met him in the hallway. "You're early today?" With pleasure the man slipped off his shoes and into his slippers. "I haven't worked much today, Heather. I need to tell you something." The woman smiled. "Sounds mysterious. Could it be that you remembered my birthday and wants to ask what to give his favourite wife?" Gary froze in the middle of the hallway with the stupidest smile on his face. To cover his slip-up, he let out a joyful exclamation. "Of course! That's all I've been thinking about these past few days. Please, announce what you want." The man hastily kissed his wife on her chubby cheek, but Heather didn't notice his strange behaviour. Lowering her eyes modestly, she whispered, "Gary, I found a suit and purse, though the price is a bit steep." The man happily interrupted his wife. "Don't worry about the cost. You know I spare nothing for my wife. Take my card and buy whatever you want, dear. But I have some news. Your birthday is very important. But before that, I need to visit my mother. Aunt Paige, our neighbour in the village, called this morning. She said Mum is very weak and can't manage alone. It's understandable. Age is taking its toll." Heather's face grew taut, her eyes flashing with anger. She cut him off impatiently. "Stop right there. I knew you'd pull something like this. Fine, my birthday will be ruined. What about our vacation? I booked a family resort for August. What am I supposed to do about that now?" Gary attempted an innocent smile. "Why cancel? You and Kimberly can go together. You'll have a proper vacation." That was the pebble that broke the dam. Heather unleashed a torrent of reproaches, her voice rising, occasionally peppered with profanity. Gary tried several times to calm his raging wife, but his voice drowned in her shouts. The quarrel might have escalated further had Kimberly not appeared in the hallway. "Dear parents, what kind of circus are you putting on here? Could you keep it down? The neighbours are already looking at our family suspiciously." Heather, rather than quietening down, turned on her daughter. "I don't care about the neighbours. This is my home. I'll yell if I want. Cry if I want." Kimberly rolled her eyes with a grimace. "Here we go again. Daddy, what did you say to Mum to get her so worked up?" The man answered calmly, "Nothing special. Your grandma is very sick and I need to visit her. Mum's upset because she had different plans." Kimberly rushed to her father, ignoring her mother's angry glares. "Oh, Daddy, can I come with you? All my classmates have left and I'm the only one stuck in this concrete jungle." Before Gary could respond, his wife shouted just as forcefully, "No, you're not going anywhere." The teenage girl asked defiantly, "Mum, why not? I'm not going to a party, I'm going to see Grandma. What's the problem? You'll even get a break from us." Heather looked from her daughter to her husband. "To hell with you. Do what you want." Father and daughter exchanged knowing glances, while Heather disappeared into her room, leaving her husband alone with his troubled thoughts. For 17 years, Gary had been bound in marriage, and throughout those years he'd considered himself quite happy. After all, what more could a man want when his house is full and his wife a good homemaker? But lately, Gary increasingly caught himself thinking this wasn't how he'd imagined true family happiness. The man zipped up his travel bag and muttered dejectedly, "I guess I'm having a midlife crisis." Gary very much wanted to have a family atmosphere in his home, but every day the family disagreements only grew. The man avoided thinking about the possible consequences of confronting his wife, still hoping they would somehow find their way back to mutual understanding. Deep down, he realized that the time for mending their relationship had passed, and the most obvious sign was their decision to sleep in separate rooms. Heather had initiated these new arrangements. One evening after a dinner party at friends', she wrinkled her nose in disgust and said, "Gary, you'll sleep separately tonight." He protested. "Heather, what's this about?" With a dismissive expression, she replied, "You smell terrible and snore horribly when you've been drinking." Though hurt, Gary didn't lash out. He merely hissed angrily, "As if you smell like violets yourself. Sleep alone if that's what you prefer." After that incident, Heather had found various pretexts to keep her husband out of the bedroom. Gary, tired of the humiliation, defiantly moved his belongings to another room. Surprisingly, both he and Heather quickly adapted to this arrangement, pretending it was perfectly normal. Only rarely did their relationship thaw when his wife would smile mysteriously after dinner and say, "Gary, you can visit me today. We'll watch a good movie on TV together." He would feel foolishly young again, grateful that his wife allowed him near her. This arrangement was humiliating and did nothing to strengthen their marriage. He told Heather several times that this wasn't normal for spouses, but she would immediately become defensive. "Don't like it? Find another wife." After several attempts to reason with her, Gary gave up and decided to let things be. Well, time will show who's right and who's wrong. If it weren't for Kimberly, I would have left for another woman long ago. I don't understand what I saw in Heather back then. What did she do to me? Their meeting had been pure chance. Gary was walking home from work when the sky opened up with a sudden downpour. There had been no sign of rain that morning, so he'd left his umbrella at home. Within seconds, Gary was drenched and longing to reach his dormitory. Running almost blindly through the rain, he suddenly collided with something alive and very wet. Through the curtain of rain, he made out what had blocked his path, a young woman, about 20 years old, standing in the middle of the street, holding a single sandal. Gary called out over the rain, "Miss, you nearly made me fall." She smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, I was running for cover when my heel broke off. I always have bad luck at the worst moments. The rain came at such a bad time, and of course I forgot my umbrella." While Gary didn't particularly care about the young woman's predicament, he couldn't leave her alone in such weather. "I'm without an umbrella today too, just forgetfulness. I live nearby. You're welcome to wait out the rain in my dry and warm place." The girl brightened at his suggestion. "Oh, thank you. I need to get to the other side of town." She hadn't realized her rescuer lived in a worker's dormitory. When they arrived at his room, she hesitated. Gary asked her not to worry and took a shirt from his closet. "You can change into this, and I'll put your dress in the dryer." Gary stepped outside, and 5 minutes later she handed him her wet clothes through the door and asked shyly, "Could you also fix my heel?" The young man laughed. "I'll try. I'll dry your dress, then I'll work on the heel." As her nervousness eased, she ventured, "What's your name? I'm Heather." Tilting back his head, the girl laughed, a sound that struck Gary like musical bells. By evening, the rain had stopped, and Gary offered to walk his pretty new acquaintance home. Enchanted, he listened happily to her chatter. Heather explained that she lived with her aunt because she was an orphan. Her parents had died in an accident years ago, her father instantly, while her mother had been severely injured and spent over 10 years disabled. Her aunt, her father's sister, had become her legal guardian while her mother was still alive. The girl admitted, "To be honest, my aunt frightens me a bit. She's very strict and demands total obedience. She'll definitely scold me today. I've never come home this late." "Heather, I won't let you get into trouble. I'll explain to your aunt about the weather," Gary declared firmly. "Please don't. I'd better handle it myself. If my aunt sees me with a strange man, she'll throw me out, and then I'll be homeless. When my mother had her accident, my aunt immediately set conditions, making it clear she wouldn't help anyone for free, especially her brother's wife, so Mother had no choice but to sell our apartment. My aunt lived alone. Her husband had left her when she was young, and she never had children. She took all of my mother's disability pension and my allowance. She wouldn't even let us use money for Mother's medicine, considering it a waste. My mother probably died from lack of proper treatment. She lived in constant pain, forced to endure it. Heather's story shocked the young man. In his mind, she was like a trapped princess, locked away by her cruel aunt, and he imagined himself as the noble hero who would rescue this poor orphan. That night he couldn't sleep, and by morning he knew he had fallen in love with Heather at first sight. That evening he waited for her outside her aunt's building. Heather showed no surprise at seeing him. "I knew you would come," she said. "I had that feeling in my heart." Though this was unusually forward for a first meeting, Gary didn't mind. He wanted to share his thoughts with her too. "Heather, I've been thinking all night about your difficult situation, and you know what I've concluded." Gary took a deep breath and spoke decisively. "I must save you, and I know how. Marry me. Don't say no right away. I've thought it all through. We'll start in my dormitory and eventually we'll buy our own apartment. I make good money, so this plan is completely doable." Heather was silent, but Gary could tell from her expression that she was thinking hard about his proposal. Finally she said, "You know, Gary, I agree. We might work something out, and if it doesn't work, we can always split up." Gary was so pleased with her consent that he overlooked how casually she predicted their possible future. Being deeply in love, he saw only the good in Heather and tried to ignore any warning signs. The next day, during lunch break, they met at the registry office. Since they weren't planning a big wedding, the registration was scheduled for a month and a half later. The bride's aunt flatly refused to help financially, so Gary bravely took on all the expenses himself. His mother helped considerably. Mrs. Harris, like most village women, was very careful with money and saved for emergencies. When her son announced his marriage plans, she gave him her savings without hesitation. "Here, I was saving for a rainy day, but who knows when that day will come, if ever. Take it, son, you need it now." Beyond money, Mrs. Harris devoted much effort to organising the event. Her years of experience as a cook in the village canteen taught her how to feed people well on a budget. Gary rented a small dining hall in the city centre for the wedding. His mother personally oversaw the food purchases and supervised the cooking. Thanks to her efforts, the tables overflowed with appetizers, and all guests were delighted. But the newlyweds' happiness didn't last long. Barely a month later, his beloved Heather, whom he called Princess, out of affection, revealed her true nature. One day, as Gary rushed home on wings of love, the dormitory manager let him in the dormitory lobby. "Gary, I hate to tell you this, but you must control your wife. She caused a scene. She accused your neighbour across of wishing to steal you. She not only verbally abused her, but attacked her physically. And Katie's 8 months pregnant." Gary had been friends with the husband of Heather's victim, and after this outrageous incident, the men stopped greeting each other. However, before this scandal could settle, another erupted. This time, Heather broke the washing machine and blamed another resident's wife. The young mother of 2 didn't restrain herself, and another fight nearly broke out. The dormitory manager had to take action. She waited for Gary's return and firmly declared, "Gary, I care for you like a son, but I won't tolerate your wife's behaviour. The tenants complain constantly. She's rude to everyone and meddles in others' affairs. You have 1 week to find another place to live." Anger filled him as he opened their room's door, and he demanded sternly, "Why do you think you're better than others? Why do you behave so outrageously?" Heather giggled nervously. "Gary, what's wrong?" "What's wrong?" he exploded. "Thanks to you, we're being evicted from the dormitory." He had expected tears, excuses, some admission of guilt, but Heather never admitted her mistakes. She stormed out and raced down the hall, eager to confront those who had slandered her. And after that, Gary spent a long time apologizing for his wife's deplorable behaviour. When he returned to their room, Heather was calmly doing her nails as if nothing had happened. She muttered contemptuously, "Just wait. I'll make life miserable for these freaks." Gary said wearily, "No, you won't. We're being evicted from the dorm, thanks to you." Heather's eyes widened. "Gary, where will we live?" He snapped back. "I don't know. I have enough work problems. Now I must find a new place immediately." He stormed out, slamming the door. That night, for the first time, he compared his young wife to a nasty toad. Heather truly resembled one when she lost her temper. Mrs. Harris struggled to rise from bed. "Oh, Paige, life isn't fun anymore. I've lost so much strength. I can barely get out of bed." Paige Fremont rushed to help, but the elderly woman waved away her neighbour's hand. "No, I'll manage. It's always like this in the morning. My arms and legs won't bend, but once I get moving it gets easier." Paige set a large cup on the bedside stool. Here's your tea. Have a cookie. I brought them fresh yesterday. By the way, Kathleen, forgive my interference, but I called your Gary yesterday." The elderly woman froze, cup in hand. "Paige, why? I didn't ask you to." Mrs. Harris's eyes welled with tears, and Paige responded firmly. "You didn't ask, but I called anyway. I can't stand watching you suffer. I don't understand how they can leave their mother alone."
"You've shocked me, Paige. Did I ask you to call Gary? I don't want to burden my son. He has enough troubles. I'd just be another problem falling on him like snow. I'll manage alone somehow. Please, Paige, call him back. Tell him everything's fine."
Mrs. Harris looked pleadingly into Paige's eyes, but she did not succumb to a moment's weakness. "It's too late to call off. He'll be here tonight or tomorrow. He promised to be quick, though. And listen, Kathleen, if Gary asks you to come with him, don't be stubborn. You're in no position to play the heroine." The elderly woman laughed.
"What heroine am I now? Perhaps I'd love to live with my son, but I doubt I'd get along with his Heather."
Paige was surprised. "Why, your daughter-in-law seems perfectly nice and affectionate."
Mrs. Harris spoke brokenly. "That's just for show, to make a good impression. You should have heard how she scolded Gary during their last visit. Her words are too shameful to repeat."
Paige waved dismissively. "Oh, those are just life's little troubles. Couples quarrel and make up in minutes."
"No, Paige, this is different," Mrs. Harris said, shaking her head. "By the way, don't try to soften me up, Paige. I won't forgive you for calling Gary."
Paige patted her elderly neighbour's shoulder. "You will forgive me? What choice do you have? Yes, your daughter-in-law isn't a gift, but we can't choose our relatives. Besides, you have your rights too. After all, you sent them money regularly while they were renting. Well, I should go. I have work waiting at home. You rest now. I'll come back later. Oh, and I almost forgot. Tara, our paramedic, promised to stop by. They're doing some preventative check-ups."
Mrs. Harris brightened. "Tara's coming? That's wonderful. She can check my blood pressure at least. She's such a good person. Such a shame it didn't work out with Gary back then."
Paige lingered at the door. Yes, they would have made a fine couple. But what can you do? Fate has its own plans for each of us. After the neighbour left, Mrs. Harris shuffled to the kitchen, but paused at the sideboard. Behind the glass stood a portrait of her husband, and she turned to it with sadness.
"Oh, my dear, my time is coming soon. I've grown so weak I hardly want to go on."
2 feeble tears rolled down her cheeks. Mrs. Harris quickly wiped them away, making a promise to the portrait, no more crying. She kneaded the dough and set it in a warm place to rise, then began heating the furnace. Despite her age, Kathleen Harris handled her usual tasks skillfully, while her mind wandered through memories. She and her husband had lived well together, rarely quarrelling. Tom Harris had loved and respected his wife. Their only sorrow had been their inability to have children. Mrs. Harris had tried everything, doctors, folk healers, but nothing helped. Then one day, while travelling by train from the city, she met a woman who sat beside her. The stranger had a penetrating gaze, as if she could see right through people. After studying Kathleen for a long while, she said, "You must journey with pilgrims to the holy places and drink from the spring there. This will lift the curse, and you will bear a son." As the stranger spoke, Kathleen felt mesmerized. She heard everything but couldn't move. She desperately wanted to ask where these holy places were. The stranger smiled. "It's not far. You'll learn tomorrow. You'll be called." The mysterious woman vanished, and the spell fell from Kathleen. The next day at her canteen job, the trade union chairman was making a list for an excursion to the ancient town. Kathleen initially walked past, despite his encouragement to join, but after a few steps she felt as if struck by lightning, her ears ringing. She returned to the sign-up table. "I'll go." Of all the sights, the one that stuck out the most was the small but well-preserved chapel. Kathleen went in and prayed and asked for help in what she wanted most in the world. 2 days later, she returned home full of hope. Only when her doctor confirmed her pregnancy did she truly believe in miracles. Mrs. Harris gave birth to her only son at age 40. Doctors say late-in-life children are often frail, but Gary grew into a true strongman. He easily lifted heavy machinery while helping his father repair cars. His true passion, though, was construction. He would mould houses from sand and clay, delighting in creating entire cities. Though his parents hoped he would pursue higher education, Gary chose to attend a construction college. After graduating, he joined a road construction and repair company. He found satisfaction in his work and saw no reason to change. His superiors often suggested that further education could lead to a comfortable office position, but Gary would politely reply, "Seeing the results of your labour brings joy to your soul. Sitting in an office giving orders just isn't for me." Even now, during vacation, Gary longed for work, missing Craig's quirky jokes and the special brigade spirit. As for Kimberly, the peculiarities of village life filled her with wild excitement. Just 2 days were enough for the girl to become convinced that village life was far better than city life. Every evening, Kimberly deliberately set her alarm clock to wake up early and listen to her neighbour's rooster solo performance. But what struck her most were the vast expanses that opened up just behind her grandmother's house. Each morning, Kimberly ran to the river for a cool dip, then hurried home, where her grandmother had already prepared pies with various fillings. Mrs. Harris urged her granddaughter, saying, "Eat up, dear. In the city you won't find such food, only processed products." Kimberly agreed with her grandmother. "That's right, Grandma. Mum sometimes brings home such awful things from the supermarket that even stray dogs and cats won't eat them. You cook wonderfully, just like a professional chef." This confession made the elderly woman smile. When her neighbour Paige warned her about her son's arrival, she hadn't expected Gary would bring his daughter. The woman hadn't seen her granddaughter for 5 years and was overjoyed at her arrival. She confessed to her neighbour, "Paige, I even feel rejuvenated. Kimberly is so energetic and I don't want to fall behind. It's hard to imagine that they'll leave and I'll be alone again." To all the pensioners' concerns, Paige had one answer. "Then don't stay alone. Go with them. Stay with your son for at least the winter, and then we'll see." Kimberly also urged her grandmother, "Grandma, I've decided you'll live in my room. We can move the sofa from Mum's bedroom to mine, and I'll give you my bed." Mrs. Harris asked her granddaughter in surprise, "Are you all in separate rooms?" Kimberly confirmed with a happy smile. "Uh-huh. Mum has the biggest room. She's crammed so much furniture in there that it's impossible to move around. I like having space. It's really great to have your own room. For instance, I can watch what I want on TV, not just what Mum wants." Her granddaughter's revelations caused concern, and Mrs. Harris decided to carefully ask her son about his family life. But Gary immediately responded, "Mum, you're worried for nothing. We're fine. City life is just very different from village life, and there's nothing wrong with each family member having their own room. Even psychologists say everyone needs individual space. Personally, I don't feel any discomfort from this arrangement, and my girls are happy." Mrs. Harris didn't argue with her son, but kept her own opinion. Right after arriving, Gary began putting his mother's household in order. He mowed the grass, chopped firewood, and neatly stacked it in the shed. In the evening he took fishing rods from the pantry. "Mum, I'm going to the river to unwind a bit. Maybe I'll catch something if I'm lucky." Gary walked to the river, breathing in the fresh air. Since childhood he had been an avid fisherman, and now he wanted to check his favourite spots where the fish always bit well. He ran down a small hill to the river and headed for a sprawling willow tree. Gary carefully pushed aside the green branches, but before he could pass under the old tree's shade, he heard a loud shout. "Where are you going? This spot's taken," the man asked mockingly. "Who's being so territorial here?" A guilty voice responded. "Oh, sorry, I thought it was other kids." The willow was very old, its branches forming a natural canopy over the water. The sunlight barely penetrated this space, so Gary didn't immediately see the teenager settled near the shore. The kid looked about his daughter's age. In his hands was a sophisticated spinning rod. Gary whistled. "Wow, what an impressive fishing tool you have." The boy smiled. "My mum gave it to me for my birthday." The man asked, "How's the fishing?" "Not great today. Weather's probably changing," the boy answered honestly. "Fish always sense first when the atmospheric pressure drops. They hide in the deeper waters then." Gary looked at the young fisherman with respect. "You're quite knowledgeable. How long have you been fishing?" "I was tiny when my father gave me my first fishing rod. He was crazy about fishing." "Was?" Gary asked. "Did he divorce your mum?" The boy's eyes narrowed and he said contemptuously, "No, my dad wasn't like that. He would never abandon me and my mum." There was a despairing sigh, and the boy mumbled quietly, "He died. He was a gamekeeper who stood his ground. We used to live elsewhere by another river. It had excellent fish, so big shots and important officials would come there. My father opposed such lawlessness. He confronted everyone regardless of their rank. So they removed him, because he interfered with their entertainment. I was just a kid then, only in 2nd grade. And you're Grandma Kathleen's son." Though Gary had grown up in the village, he was used to such abrupt conversational shifts. "Yes, my daughter and I came to visit my mother." The boy grinned. "Your Kimberly is all right. A decent girl." Gary was surprised again. "You've already met her?" "Yes, I like to take a dip in the river in the morning too." Gary settled down a little way from the boy. From the first minutes the fish began to bite, which caused burning envy in the owner of the cool spinning rod. "You probably have your own secret?" the boy asked respectfully. Gary laughed quietly. "Yes, I have a secret. I used to fish here, and the river dwellers recognized me and decided to say hello." The boy laughed. "You've made me laugh, and Kimberly is funny too. Listen, boy, we've been talking for half an hour, and I still don't know your name." The boy was embarrassed. "I'm Sam Hills. My mum works here as a paramedic. We used to live in the district centre when my dad was alive, and then my mum was transferred here to work. They gave us a separate house, and I've already gotten used to it. It's not bad here, and the school is close by." Gary listened to the boy, his brain working feverishly. Suddenly it hit him. Could he be Tara's son? He cautiously asked the teenager, "Sam, is your mum's name Tara, by any chance?" The boy smiled again. "Yeah, do you know her?" "I guess I do. Really, I'm not sure, but I think your mum and I were friends in childhood." Gary came home with an almost full bucket of assorted fish, and in high spirits. Mrs. Harris was giving her granddaughter cooking lessons. Noticing her son on the doorstep, she said cheerfully, "Well, Kimberly, our fisherman is back. Looks like we'll be cooking soup today. I'll go outside to clean the fish, and you, Gary, rest for now." The man followed her. "Mom, I'm not tired at all. Let me help you." Mrs. Harris watched as her son deftly cleaned the fish.
Well, while you're doing fine here, I'll go put the water on. Tara should be here soon. I'll treat her to some fish. She visits me every other day. They have some program for heart patients. It's nice to be cared for like that,"
Gary said confidently.
"It's okay, Mum. Now we'll take care of you all the time. And thank Tara very much, of course."
Mrs. Harris, thoughtful, froze on the porch.
"She's a good woman. Yes, she was also unlucky in life. Her husband died and they never found who did it. Or maybe didn't want to look. Gary, do you remember how you chased after Tara?"
The man laughed.
"How could I forget? Tara broke my heart. That's when I first learned how cruel women can be. I was only 2 years younger than she was, and she dismissed me, said I was still a child, and it was too early for me to fall in love with a grown-up girl."
Gary spoke with a chuckle, but old resentment slipped into his voice. The mother realized that her son was nervous about meeting his first love. Tara visited her elderly patient toward evening. She was embarrassed when she saw Gary on the porch.
"Hello, Gary.
I'm here to see Mrs. Harris." He obligingly opened the door for her.
"Come in. My mum has been waiting for you. She wants to treat you to some fish."
The woman went into the house, saying,
"My son told me about your fishing trip together, though he couldn't boast of the catch. Only caught 2 fish for the cat's dinner."
Gary grinned.
"I confess it's my fault. I deliberately poached all the fish."
Tara shook her head. "And you, Gary, still joking. Tell me how you live, what you do. We haven't seen each other for ages."
"We'll have a chance to talk and remember the best moments of our youth. My daughter and I are here for a week, and now, on my own behalf and Mother's, I invite you to have dinner with us."
In the village, it wasn't customary to refuse a treat. It could offend the hosts, and Tara agreed. After dinner, Gary volunteered to accompany her. Almost the whole way they were silent. Gary couldn't boast of his family life, and Tara wasn't one to show off her problems. He walked her to the gate and, saying goodbye, wished her sweet dreams. A day later, the paramedic visited again. She measured Mrs. Harris's blood pressure and listened to her heart. "Mrs. Harris, everything is generally fine, but we should do a cardiogram. Why don't you come to my office?" The old woman said sadly,
"I guess that won't be possible. My son is taking me to his place. I'm afraid to go."
Tara reassured the patient. "If your son wants you to go, you should. You'll have better medical care there within walking distance, not like here." The whole village came to see Mrs. Harris off. Paige cried at the departure, not wanting to part with her friend from the harsh days. They were on the train when Kimberly remembered. "Daddy, it's Mum's birthday today. We should have left yesterday. She'll definitely be offended." Gary mentally scolded himself but remained silent. He was almost certain Heather wouldn't make a scene over his small blunder. However, his hopes were not realized. His wife met him with a cascade of reproaches and didn't even greet her mother-in-law. Mrs. Harris had only read about hell in books and heard about it from the pastor in church, but after moving in with her son, she found herself in its very centre. At first, the daughter-in-law behaved quite decently. She didn't mind her mother-in-law moving into her daughter's room, but on the very first day, Heather couldn't hold back and reproached Mrs. Harris. "You must have entertained your son so well that he forgot his obligations." Mrs. Harris didn't know how to reply. She asked uncertainly,
"Heather, darling, what are Gary's obligations? Did he owe money to someone?"
The daughter-in-law bristled as if stung.
"Gary owes me, first of all. He promised to show up on my birthday, and on such a day I sat alone like an idiot," the elderly woman observed. "Please forgive him. He was too busy in the village."
Heather grinned contemptuously and decided to vent her anger on her husband. Mrs. Harris heard her berating Gary.
"Was it your decision to give me such a gift? Did you bring your mother? Did you even ask if I agreed?"
Gary responded to his wife, but the words were indistinct. Kimberly noticed Mrs. Harris's confusion about the situation. "Grandma, don't pay attention. Mum missed him for a week and decided to remind Dad who's boss of the house."
"Do you have such scandals often?"
the old woman asked.
Kimberly laughed. "Grandma, this isn't a scandal, just a light warm-up. When Mum really gets angry, the windows shake and the neighbours pound on the walls to calm them." "I shouldn't have come,"
the elderly woman burst out involuntarily. The grandmother laughed again. "Grandma, don't be afraid. I'll teach you how to behave properly. You just have to ignore Mum's yelling. Then she'll vent and calm down."
"Child, does she yell at you too?"
The girl sighed. "If only that. Mum might even hit with whatever's at hand. What can you do, Grandma? We can't choose our mothers." That first night, Mrs. Harris couldn't sleep. She tossed in the bed her granddaughter had kindly given up, turning unhappy thoughts over in her mind.
"Yes, I walked into a trap through my own stupidity. I should have stayed home."
Only when dawn began breaking did she fall into restless sleep. In the morning, she heard Heather telling Kimberly,
"Stay until your grandmother wakes up, show her how to use everything here, and don't forget to feed Grandma."
Mrs. Harris's heart lightened a bit. She thought,
"I'm not to blame for my daughter-in-law. She may seem harsh, but she's actually kind. She takes care of me."
The first few days, Kimberly stayed near her grandmother. They baked pies together in the kitchen and went to the park for fresh air. But soon her granddaughter's interest waned, and she began leaving early in the morning. "Grandma, you won't get bored here alone. Turn on the TV, watch a movie. I won't be long. I'll be back soon." Left alone, Mrs. Harris wanted to occupy herself. Something was wrong with the TV, and the elderly woman decided to read instead. Since the family library was in her daughter-in-law's room closet, she had to cross privacy boundaries. That day, Heather returned from work before her husband. She went straight to her room, and an outraged shriek erupted soon.
"Who's been rummaging around?"
The mother-in-law emerged from the next room and said guiltily,
"Heather, I'm sorry. I slightly disturbed your order. I couldn't manage the TV, so I decided to read a book."
The indignant daughter-in-law cut her off, rushing up to wave her hands in the elderly woman's face.
"You can't take anything here without my permission. Remember that, please."
The woman recoiled in fright, her heart racing. Remembering her pills, she started searching for her purse, but her daughter-in-law burst into her daughter's room.
"No, you don't seem to understand anything. What are you snooping around for?"
Mrs. Harris timidly mumbled,
"I'm looking for my bag. My pills are in there."
The daughter-in-law softened slightly. "You should have said right away that you needed the bag. It's in the hallway closet. We don't leave things lying around, and we keep medications in one place. There's a special cabinet in the kitchen. Come on, I'll show you." Mrs. Harris followed her daughter-in-law, who showed her where medicines and bandages were kept. After taking her medicine, the old woman felt better and fell asleep. That evening she skipped dinner, fearing her daughter-in-law's anger. For 2 weeks, everything was quiet. Heather discovered her mother-in-law's other transgression when, returning from work, she went to the bathroom. Autumn came, and Kimberly went to school. Now Mrs. Harris was left alone all day long. It was good that she had learned to use the television. The elderly woman tried to please her daughter-in-law in everything, realizing her future fate depended on Heather. Her son rarely paid attention to his mother, because he was always busy. Her only consolation was her granddaughter. One day after school, Kimberly said, "Grandma, we haven't cooked together in so long. I'm craving your cabbage pies." Mrs. Harris brightened. "Well then, check if there's flour in the house. We'll quickly make pies and feed Mum and Dad." Grandmother and granddaughter happily began their task, but couldn't finish it. The door slammed in the hallway, and Kimberly whispered, "Grandma, I think Mum's here. I'll go distract her while you clean up." The elderly woman hurriedly began cleaning their workspace, but Heather burst into the kitchen furiously. "What are you doing here? You've turned the apartment into a stable." Mrs. Harris pleaded, "Heather, I'll clean up quickly. The pies will be ready soon. They're already in the oven." The daughter-in-law pushed her mother-in-law, who lost her balance. She fell hard on her side and cried out in pain. Heather, ignoring her mother-in-law's cries, rushed to the stove. "How many times must I tell you not to touch anything?" In her anger, she loomed menacingly over the woman, writhing in pain on the kitchen floor. Kimberly pushed her mother aside and rushed to her grandmother. "Grandma, what's wrong? Where does it hurt?" Mrs. Harris pointed to her side. "I must have bruised myself badly when I fell." She kept from her granddaughter and son that her daughter-in-law had pushed her. But the pain was so unbearable that they had to go to the hospital. When the doctor examined the bruise, he whistled. "That's quite a fall, Granny. Not good at all. You likely have broken ribs." Later that day, Gary confronted his wife. "What happened here? Did you do this?" Heather, seeing her husband's unprecedented anger, made frightened excuses. "Gary, she did it herself. Honestly, I had nothing to do with it." Mrs. Harris spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Kimberly visited daily, though sadness clouded her face. When discharge day came, Gary took time off work to collect his mother. The attending doctor warned him, "At this age, fractures heal poorly. Your mother's recovery is very slow. She needs special care. I've written all the recommendations, but focus on nutrition. She needs calcium-rich foods. And of course, attention and care are essential to her treatment." Gary was lost. Unable to provide the necessary conditions for his mother's recovery himself, he brought Mrs. Harris home and turned hopefully to his wife. "Heather, Mother's fractures haven't fully healed." But his wife cut him off. "Don't start. I know what you're going to say. Gary, don't even think about it. I won't look after your mother. A specialized nursing home is best for her situation. They have professional staff and good care." Gary froze briefly while Heather pressed on. "The only thing I'll help with is expediting the paperwork. I have a friend in Social Security who can speed things up." Without a word, Gary retreated to his room. Mrs. Harris lay on her granddaughter's bed, crying silently. She'd heard everything and understood her son had no choice. He couldn't quit his job to care for his sick mother. He had a family to feed. Heather, eager to remove her helpless mother-in-law, tackled the task zealously. She gathered all necessary documents and arranged for doctors to examine the old woman at home. Gary knew his wife's true intentions. He tried several times to appeal to her conscience, but found it impenetrable. He avoided his mother's room, ashamed to face the woman who had given him life. Though torn by remorse, he was powerless. Leaving his mother here meant condemning her to a slow death. His wife always kept her word and would ignore her mother-in-law, even in dire need. He was ashamed to admit his powerlessness in his own home, and tried convincing himself his mother would fare better in a nursing home. The dreaded day arrived, and Gary packed with a heavy heart. Mrs. Harris remained calm about spending her remaining days in the nursing home, surrounded with strangers. Before leaving, she looked at her daughter-in-law and said sadly, "People act without considering consequences. Heather, you'll grow old too, and your daughter or granddaughter might not want to dispose of you. Have you never thought of that?"
"Shut up, you old witch! That won't happen to me. I'm not worthless like you."
The elderly woman took one last look at her daughter-in-law and left the apartment. Gary gently settled his mother in the back seat and whispered,
"Mum, I'm sorry this happened."
Mrs. Harris tried to smile.
"That's all right, son. There are many lonely people my age in the nursing home, so I won't be bored there. Don't worry about me. You've got a family to think about. It's much easier to destroy than to preserve."
His mother's words sank into the man's heart. They drove some distance before he dared to ask, "Mother, is it worth preserving something meaningless? Wouldn't it be better to destroy this nonsense and start over?" The woman spoke quietly.
"I don't know, son. You must decide what matters most to you."
Gary whispered,
"Yes, it's not an easy choice, and I can't afford another mistake."
Then the brakes screeched, and Mrs. Harris cried out in surprise,
"Son, has your car broken down?" "No, Mum. Nothing's wrong with the car. We're not going to the nursing home. We're going home,"
the man declared cheerfully.
"Home? But Heather won't let us in."
"Mum, we're not going there. Our home is somewhere else entirely." Mrs. Harris realized what her son meant. She began to cry.
"Gary, don't be foolish. I'm not worth ruining your life over. You have a family, work."
Gary, seized by excitement, drove faster and told his mother,
"Mum, I could find work in the village if I want. And as for a wife, well, I'm not too old yet. I'll ask Tara. What if she says yes?"
Mrs. Harris listened and shook her head. Meanwhile, Heather grew worried when Gary didn't return at the arranged time. She dialed his cell phone, but he was unavailable. The woman was furious and stayed up all night, staring into the darkness outside the window, but Gary never appeared. He wasn't there in the morning either. Heather woke her daughter, and Kimberly noticed her mother's tear-stained eyes. "Mum, are you crying because of Dad?"
"Just be quiet. I'm sick of all of you,"
Heather shouted.
"Your useless father can't do anything. And that old woman, I hate her with all my heart. She's the one who turned everything upside down here. We were fine while she was gone."
The daughter objected quietly. "Mum, you were the only one who thought that. Our house has been chaotic for a long time, and you're the cause of it."
Heather lunged at her daughter. "How dare you talk to your mother like that? Getting too grown up? Too bold? Or did your grandmother turn you against me?"
Kimberly dodged the blow. "Mum, do you want me to leave too?" Heather, completely losing control, began pushing her daughter toward the door.
"Go to your daddy. I can manage without you."
The girl ran down the steps in tears, not knowing what to do, but suddenly she had an idea. She decided to go to her granny's house and stay there for a while. She reached the village at dusk, and with relief noticed the light in her grandmother's house. As soon as she opened the door, she found herself in her father's embrace. Gary was distraught.
"Daughter, we've been so worried. Your mother is looking for you."
Kimberly gave a wry smile. "Dad, yesterday and this morning she was looking for you and cursing everyone. Look,
I'm not going back to that madhouse."
Gary sensed this was a crucial moment. His decision would affect his daughter's future. He glanced at his mother, sitting quietly in the corner.
"Daughter, I'm not going back either. I almost betrayed the person dearest to me, and I won't make that mistake again."
Gary stayed at his mother's house. Kimberly planned to settle in the village too, but soon Heather arrived and immediately started a scene.
"Heather, if you make another visit like this, I'll take serious measures. I won't let you damage our daughter's mental health. Kimberly doesn't want to live with you. That's her choice, and you must respect it."
Heather left and never returned to the village. Months later, Gary checked their apartment, where he'd never managed to create a happy home. It was empty, except for a note on the kitchen table. "I'll never forgive you for this. Don't try to find me."
The man smirked. "Such self-righteousness. No one's going to look for you, Heather."
Soon he was a divorced man, and he started planning a wedding. He and Tara married, and a year later they had a daughter. Mrs. Harris delighted in caring for her granddaughter, named Kathleen in her honour. Gary never saw his first wife again, though he heard through others that she'd moved far, seeking her happiness. As for Gary, he had finally realised what it means to be truly loved.